Hey, my name is Paige Epley, and this is my older adult video presentation. I conducted the older adult interview with a family friend. Her name is Helen, and I picked her given that she has a lot of family experience, a lot of social and mental health experience. Her story is very interesting, and I thoroughly enjoyed interviewing her through this process. I was allowed to learn a lot of things about her life that I had yet to discover in just interacting with her socially. So Helen was born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1932. She had one younger brother, just her and her younger brother with her mom and her dad. Her mother was a stay-at-home mom, and her dad was a buyer for a department store. So he essentially would buy brands and items to be put in like a Macy's or JCPenney or whatever happened to be around at the time. So Helen and her family moved a lot given her father's career. So he constantly moved the family. She moved when she was 6 years old from Brooklyn to Baltimore. And her family is a very strong Italian Catholic family. So she established school in a Catholic school. And she recalled not being able to learn how to print. In school, she learned how to script write, which is her reference for cursive, essentially, being that when she was in New York, she only did, like, printing, essentially. So Helen started struggling in school at that point, and her teacher called and complained about her being far behind. So fast forward to about 15 years old. They moved again from Baltimore back to Brooklyn, and she left the private Catholic schools and entered into public school. Helen really struggled with this in that she claimed that there were snooty girls in the public school, ones that she did not get along with and ones that she wanted to not be around. So Helen opted at 16 years old to drop out of high school. So this is all, somewhat background information. Going forward, we will be talking about Helen in the intimacy versus the isolation stage, so the young adulthood stage of Erikson's developmental theories. So with this one, this is between 18 and 40 years old, roughly, and we're looking at, how Helen was interactive during that point in time. So, in first looking at this developmental stage, it is the intimacy versus isolation stage. Again, it occurs in young adulthood. This stage is stage number 6 out of 8. And this is a time where people are finding themselves in the world and kind of placing where they belong. So we learned earlier that people want to have an innate need to be heard and listened to, and have a need to be wanted and a part of things. So in looking at this this particular stage, this is where people make connections, make friendships, make relationships, have children, connect with their parents in a different way, connect with other family members in a different way, and just kind of build upon their relationships that have already been established, or even establishing new relationships and building upon those accordingly. This is also a time for people to be connected, as we have that innate need to belong and to be a part of something. This is a time where if our relationships aren't positive, if they aren't beneficial, if they are detrimental in any kind of way, part of our process in dealing with that is to kind of like lose ourselves. So we go into an isolation phase and aren't really sure who we are without being in this relationship. Or you'll often hear sometimes parents saying, like, if I go to the grocery store by myself, without my toddler, I feel really awkward. I feel like I've left something at home because I don't know who I am if I am not their mom. Same thing in a relationship when there's a lot of some codependency issues. A lot of times you will hear, I don't know who I am without so-and-so around, or I don't know who I am if I'm not their partner, if I'm not their wife, if I'm not their husband, what have you. So this stage is one that Helen experienced a lot of issues in throughout her life. So like I said previously, she didn't complete high school. She dropped out at age 16, which is technically before this developmental stage. However, I think it's critical to know that because it kind of gives a little inkling into her trajectory and what that started with. So she ended up not going back to school. She didn't graduate high school, didn't get a diploma, didn't go to college. She stayed at home from 16 to 22, and at 22, she met this young fella who worked for her father as a purchaser or a buyer for the local department store, and she just kind of fell in love with him. Her dad and her mom kind of discouraged the relationship a little bit. He was older than she was, and they weren't too excited that Helen was getting involved with someone similar to her father. So Helen and her husband ended up getting eloped. So they went out one night telling their parents that they were going to go out for some ice cream to the local Five and Dime or whatever they called it, and went across state lines and got married at the first town that they came to, which is very reminiscent of a country song from the 80s and very sweet at the same time. So once she was married, she wanted to enter the workforce. She didn't really have a job between the time she was 16 to 22. Her father really took care of her and her mother and her brother. So she established working as a secretary for her husband, for his purchasing business. And she completed that task for 8 months to a year, essentially. And her husband made her quit. So he decided that she needed to be a stay-at-home parent and that they were going to move and establish a family. And he did not want her to work. So he forced her to leave the workforce. And Helen recalls a lot of stress and conflict during that point because she had, was assertive that she wanted to work and he was very assertive that she was not going to work. So they moved multiple times between the northeastern parts of America, and then moved to California and then to Arizona and back and forth, spent several times in several states. It seems that she moved almost every 5 to 7 years. They just picked up the family and moved. Helen and her husband had 2 children, and Helen was a stay-at-home mother. During this time where she was raising her children and being a stay-at-home mother, she experienced a lot of domestic violence issues and a lot of mental health issues, and she recalls and comments about the domestic violence issues as being that whatever my husband said is whatever was gospel. It was whatever was true. You didn't ask him to clarify. You didn't ask him to explain why or give further information. You just did what he said. So she was very depressed during this time. She made the comment that she had everything she wanted in her life. She had 2 perfect children. She had a beautiful home. She moved all the time. She toured the country. She had all the monetary and materialistic things she could ever ask for, but she was deeply unhappy and deeply depressed. She has always struggled with her weight and her self-esteem, even when she was younger, and that just kind of manifested as an adult. She would go on fad diets and try to do, exercising around the block with mommy and me clubs and just hanging out with other housewives and trying to fit the standard that she thought that her husband wanted her to be. And unfortunately, that wasn't a possibility. Long story short, she sought care for her mental health issues and ended up in some multiple rounds of electric shock therapy. Again, with continuing with her deep depression, her mood swings. She self-reports that she was never fully diagnosed as bipolar, but She firmly believes that she had a bipolar diagnosis. She spent a stint at a psychiatric inpatient facility for a little bit in Texas when they lived there, and then reports constant domestic violence issues. So, challenges and accomplishments during this stage, given her lack of self-esteem and her self-confidence and inability to continue through the workforce and her dropping out of school, Helen didn't really feel that she had a lot of accomplishments. She stated that her only accomplishments were her children, essentially. The mental health issues that manifested during the stage did continue throughout her life. She is still struggling with them as of today and is medicated and usually using therapy and medication management to control those. She continues to have self-esteem and confidence issues. There's a lot of codependency with her children as well that she acknowledges. She had security issues with her partner, so she, again, married the first person that came along because she had low self-esteem, and it was the first guy that was interested, and they crossed the state lines and eloped. So when he was on business trips, she was constantly fearful of his infidelity and some issues that were centered around that. Nothing was reported to actually be true. However, she was still remained concerned and apprehensive, and she again lost her identity. She was a mom. She didn't have anything else to fall back on. And when her children went to elementary school or middle school or even high school, she didn't know what to do. She didn't pick up a skill. She didn't pick up a trade. She didn't pick up a hobby. Essentially, she was a homemaker. She made sure that her children had everything that they needed and that the house was up to standards for society and for her husband. And that was her job. She maintained that. And didn't move from that home until, 5 or 6 years later when they moved as a family and started all over, and her roles continued the same. So during this intimacy versus isolation stage, there's a few crises that go along with this. So one is being the risk of depression when your relationships fail or they're not positive ones. This can occur through like domestic violence or abuse or neglect or any kind of negative relationship challenges. With Helen, her self-esteem and dependency issues emerged during this stage and aided to some of the crisis that she experienced. She grew up in a strong Catholic home, born in the 30s, so she was taking care of relationships in the 50s and trying to adhere to societal standards, physically and mentally, and she classified herself as like an upper middle class kind of description for her and her husband and her family. And I think that was part of their intent on moving, is once the neighborhood got a little nicer and their house got a little less nice, they moved to a nicer one. She recalls every house she moved to every 5 years being a bigger and better and more expensive home. So they were very much so trying to keep up with the Joneses, essentially, and are very materialistic and put all of their self-worth into what they had, which come back to haunt her, essentially, at her current stage in life when she's realizing that materialistic things aren't necessarily the best when there's no one to share them with. So, a biopsychosocial resolution that could have helped her throughout this stage in her life, throughout the crisis, was the limited financial resources. So she did describe herself as an upper middle class, but that's based off one income feeding 4 mouths. So they put their money into things and not into people. So they had the best cars, they had the best carpet, they had the best yard, the kids had the best clothes, they went to the best schools, but they didn't invest in themselves. They didn't financially invest into their future and their mental health. Given that they constantly moved, there was lack of treatment, being that she was never in one place long enough to establish a primary care that would be able to help her throughout these episodes and these issues. there was also the social stigma of just trying to keep up with the Joneses and be the best family that they could possibly be.